Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a Brightspace Community Site webinar. We're really excited to have you all joining us here today to learn more about the Brightspace Competencies tool. My name is Roxana Lavrekovic, and I am your Brightspace Community Facilitator, here to help connect you to D2L's technology services, resources, and content. Really quickly before we get started, I just want to talk about what the setup of your screen looks like right now. You do have the ability to customize it in a way that you feel most comfortable, but what we have on the standard template is the screen share that Delia is going to be working off of, as well as a Q&A pod, which I encourage you to put your questions into. Delia is going to do her best to get to those questions throughout the webinar. However, anything that we can't answer throughout will be looked at the end, and if we can't get to all those questions, we will be following up every webinar, as we do historically, with a blog post. And we can tag you in that blog post as well, just to make sure that you do get our full rounded response once it's complete and posted. Today, Delia Kuto, D2L Senior Solutions Engineer, is going to be discussing the Competencies tool, which enables you to define and assess learning outcomes within Brightspace. We'll also be taking a look at the administrative features of the Competencies tool that allow institutional and program administrators to define student learning outcomes, align them to courses, and ensure that they are being met. We're also going to learn how the Competencies tool can be used for program assessment, course learning outcomes, and embedded assessment of core competencies. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Delia to get started on her presentation.
Thanks, Roxana. So everybody should be hearing me okay and seeing my screen. If you have any issues throughout, just put it into the group chat. And as Roxana mentioned, feel free to use the Q&A pod to put in questions. I will do my best. I've got a second monitor. I'll do my best to review those throughout. And a little bit about myself before we start. I've been a solutions engineer at D2L for just over 5 years now, 5 years and 2 months to be specific. And as Roxana mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the use of the competency tool from an administrative standpoint in talking about how to create competency structures at higher levels and share down for various outcomes assessment strategies. So specifically, as an agenda, we're going to first review a few different outcomes assessment strategies. It'd be great to get an idea from everybody that's attending today what specific strategies you're most interested in. I want to hit all of them, but put it in some special focus if there are some that are more popular than others with this specific group. And then we're going to learn the basics of how to create competency structures and design assessments at a programmatic level that's going to apply to all assessment strategies. So specifically, how to build competency and outcome structures using the competency tool at higher levels of the organizational hierarchy in Brightspace and share them down to the right org units. And how to do the same thing for rubrics. So if rubrics are going to be used for assessment of outcomes, how can we create those at higher levels and bring them and share them down to the faculty or the evaluators that need it. And then finally, how do we align outcomes with assessment activities and trigger or define achievement thresholds so that achievement can be triggered and we can see results. So after we learn those three basic tenets, then we're going to then revisit the different outcome assessment strategies and see how they can be differently applied specifically for the assessment. And then end with reviewing results. And again, if you have questions throughout, feel free. I'd love for this to be a discussion as we go on. We can go into different areas depending on people's interests, but we will leave some time at the end for any final Q&A that people may have. Okay, so let's start with outcome assessment strategies. And it looks like my slides are being a little cut off, so let me just move this down so that Just give me a second. I'm just going to change my screen. Okay, so hopefully that loads back up, and then you'll see the bottom of number 3 there. Perfect. So I'd like to talk about 3 main strategies today. The first one being ensuring that student learning outcomes are being met across courses in a program or in a degree. So in this specific use case, student learning outcomes are being programmatically defined at some higher level. And they're defined for instructors, so instructors will be using them in courses. And as a program administrator, for example, you need to have aggregate reporting in order to ensure that those student learning outcomes are indeed being met in those courses. Number 2 is a little different. It's a program assessment requirement that exists outside of a specific course, set of courses, or any course activity. So in this use case, students are submitting evidence that they have met, let's say, program requirements over time. For example, a teaching portfolio that they have to submit to maybe a program assessment committee, not to a specific course, not to a specific instructor, but more for a program-based assessment outside of that. And number 3, ensuring students meet broader institutional outcomes, such as creative writing and thinking. So ensuring those students meet those broader institutional learning outcomes, or ILOs, as I might mention them. This is often called core competencies as well. And it could be a combination, so students do have to submit evidence for this as well, but it could be a combination of curricular and co-curricular activities that they're doing. So they do have to submit some sort of evidence of how they've been achieving these broader outcomes in different areas. So I thought maybe we could do an informal poll using the group chat area, using the numbering system here. If you open the group chat area, you should see the ability to submit. If everybody could put in the numbers of what you're currently doing, or what you're interested in right now going forward, that would be great. So here's an example. I'll start off. So if I were interested in, right now we're doing a lot of student learning outcomes, I'm going to put in 1, and then, but I also have some program assessment requirement for the School of Education, so I'm going to do 1, 2. So perfect. Yep, I see the results coming in. So I'll just wait a minute while we see that. Seeing a lot of 1s so far, a couple of 2s, more 1s and 2s, a couple of 3s. All right, yep, and that's about perfect, more 1s and 2s, and a little bit of 3s. Oh, great, Jeffrey, yep, 1 and 3, that's a good one. So I'm seeing so far a lot of 1s and 2s, program assessment requirements, ensuring student learning outcomes are met across courses, and a little bit of the 3, and that's what I'm seeing across clients in general. And Renee, 1 now in D12, 2 and 3 outside of D12. It's really good information to have too. Perfect. So we'll be talking about how to do all 3 potentially in D12. But yeah, I'm seeing this a lot in that right now there's a lot of stuff being done with strategies number 1 and 2, but number 3 is a growing one. So we'll definitely hit upon that as well. Great. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and actually, so is there everybody seeing the end of that slide too? I just want to make sure that you see the bottom of that. I think so. Great. So let us start with the basics in what we're going to need to do for each of those 3 strategies, and then we'll talk about how to specifically do each of those. So we've learned the basics. Our first step is going to be creating competency structures in the system. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm seeing a question come in about my slide is being covered by a few things. Okay. How's this? Is that better for everyone? Okay. So step one is to create competency structures at higher levels of the learning environment and share them down into further areas or further organizational units in your organizational hierarchy. So I'm going to switch over to a demonstration site. And most of this webinar I'm going to be demoing so that you can see this, so that you can actually do this in your own environments. Evan, I see your question coming in. It was cut off by the icon menu, but you can click and drag your slide window up about. Okay, hopefully I've dragged it, I think I've dragged it as far as I can go, so hopefully it's, you can see pretty much everything, but I'll keep that in mind if there's something that's being cut off on the bottom. Let me zoom in on this environment. This is a learning environment sandbox that I have that we're going to be playing around with. And the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of creating competency structures using the competency tool is noting that if you are in if you're in as administrator, there is an admin tools menu on the top right-hand side. And there is a competencies tool here. Now we're going to talk about how to get to the competencies tool at further organizational units, so at a program, degree level, whatever custom org units you want to create between the top level and a course. You can also create competencies there, but we'll start with the very top level. So as an administrator, I have the competencies tool as one of my items. It should be listed under course related. And I click on that, and I will have the ability to create competency structures here. And a little bit about competency structures. There are three main components of the competencies tool structure. The blue items are called competencies, and this is just a naming convention that we use. However, you might have different naming. In fact, all the clients that I've worked with will have slightly different naming. So think of a competency as a broad area. The yellow item underneath that falls under a competency is called a learning objective in the competencies tool, but this could be a learning outcome as well. Essentially, this is the outcome that's going to be measured. And because it's going to be measured, a learning objective or a learning outcome, the yellow object, is aligned to this red item, which is an activity, and that is the actual instrument of measurement. That's what we're going to align the learning objective or outcome to and define an achievement threshold so that can trigger achievement reporting. So competencies need to have at least one yellow item, the learning objective or learning outcome, and learning objectives must have at least one activity in order for this system to work and for roll-up reporting to happen. So, and you can have as many different learning objectives or outcomes and competencies in the structure. You can make this as complex of a hierarchy that you need to. So in this example on the right hand side, we see that we have some learning outcomes, but we have a sub-learning outcome being applied underneath another learning outcome. So maybe this level could be the learning outcome, and these are the sub-learning objectives, and those are being tied to activities. Think of the competencies. We do have a competency that's under a parent competency as well. Think of the competencies as the things that are a broader outcome or a broader competency that's not being directly measured. So it almost acts as a good point in the hierarchy for aggregate reporting. So for example, if this was creative thinking, and these were all of the different outcomes that were related to creative thinking, if as a student, if I achieve all of the learning outcomes that are children to the creative thinking competency that I've created here, then I automatically achieve the creative thinking competency. So think of the competency as that. It's not something that's being directly measured, but it could be an aggregate of the measurement that's happening beneath it. So let's have a look at the site again and learn how to build these structures. So I've already created some sample structures here. And there are 3 different structures that I've created as examples. I have institutional level competencies for, let's say, gen ed requirements. I have some core competencies that all students need to eventually achieve in order to graduate. And then I have some program-specific student learning outcomes. So you might be calling these PLOs or SLOs. I find SLOs to be very common. And just like when we talked about having the different structures, you can have learning objectives under learning objectives and competencies under competencies. Here's an example of information technology and quantitative literacy having some sort of sub-outcomes associated with it as well. So in this case, if students achieve all of these, then they achieve the information technology and quantitative literacy outcome. And also, if students meet all 4 of the core competencies, then they will get a check mark here that, yes, they have achieved all of the institutional level core competencies as well. So that's a little bit about how that works. In order to create this structure, you'll want to use the New button in here. And then here you can create competencies and learning objectives. So if I create a new competency, let's say I have the School of Education, student learning outcomes. I can put in a description for that. So I'm starting with a competency, thinking of this as like a category that's going to encompass the outcomes underneath. Status as draft, it will let you know what this that this means that the competency is still being worked on. And once you're ready for it to be used in live courses, then you can change that to approved, and that locks down the ability to change the competency or the children underneath. So you will want to keep it in draft until you're ready for it to be actually used in live courses. Make competency and its children visible to users. If you want students and instructors to see that in the list of competencies when they go into their courses, then you would check that off. And you can also specify if you want reevaluation of users who have previously achieved this competency, or once they have achieved it, then that's it. They've achieved it forever, right? So that's an option that's made available for you. And then this, actually, I'll skip over to achievement criteria here for the moment. This is a good one for both the learning objectives or outcomes as well as the competencies, determining if there are going to be multiple courses where this is being assessed, then what's going to trigger achievement if it's used, or if a student achieves it in one course, or do they have to achieve it in all courses that this is being assessed? So that's where you would choose that, that specific feature. Renee, you ask if you want to understand reevaluation better. So just clicking on the help here gives you a little bit more information, but basically it's letting you know that it will determine whether students who have achieved this competency in the past are reevaluated when the competency is changed. So let's, a good example here is if you add an additional learning objective or learning outcome underneath, that when the student originally achieved this competency, that didn't exist underneath. So this setting determines, is that going to reset their achievement? So because there's a new learning outcome that they have not yet achieved, they have to now achieve that in order to regain the competency, or is it going to grandfather their historical achievement? Does that help answer your question? Hopefully yes. Okay. So last thing that I want to mention is this is really important in setting up programmatic outcomes. Make competency available to. This is going to share down the structure that we are creating to organizational units under the organizational unit that we are creating these competency structures, so down to the course level. And if I click on Add Org Units, I can pick by course offerings, course templates. I can look for departments as well. So I can filter by departments here and say everything under this department should see this competency structure. So here we have Department of Education. Perfect. And then I can say, well, this competency structure should be available to all descendants. That's the important part. All descendants. That means that all of the course templates and all of the courses under the Department of Education will see this competency structure. And then click on Insert. Perfect. And then Save. Also, to add learning objectives or outcomes to that, you can click on the competency, click on Structure, Edit Structure, and under Children, you can see what you can now add as a children. So maybe you want another competency, maybe you want to create a new learning objective. I'll create a new learning objective. And put in, so let's say, K-12, just as an example. So I put in the name of the learning objective or outcome. This is a thing that's actually going to be measured and tied to an activity. There is an assessment method that you can enforce. We're going to talk about, so these are the different ways that this could be assessed in the environment: discussions, assignments, grades. Assignments is also a submission of a portfolio or some sort of artifact of evidence. Doesn't necessarily have to be an assignment in a course. Manual assessments, or you're going to manually check off once a student or once a learner achieves this. Quizzes and surveys. Or if you don't want to enforce it, so you're going to figure out how you're going to assess this later on depending on the specific situation. I like to generally keep this as a no. And then lastly, ready for evaluation. So this means that this will actually allow users to complete the learning objectives. If you don't have this on for ready, then when you're testing this out as a student, you're not actually going to see any achievement results. So having this as a yes says, okay, yep, this is ready for evaluation. So when students actually attempt this, after I define an achievement threshold, it's going to trigger achievement and it's going to show up in reporting. So that's the difference there. You can keep it as no if you're setting these up as draft, and then switch it over to yes later on. But I haven't even shared this down to students, so I can actually keep it as a yes and then set up my, my alignment afterwards. So now I have a very simple structure. If I go back to my competency home, I have one competency here and then one learning outcome, teaching K-12. And this is now shared down, this whole structure, because I shared down from this competency, both the School of Education SLOs item and the Teaching K-12 item should be shown in all courses under the Department of Education. Evan asks, if the parent competency is still in draft, the evaluation being set to yes won't matter, correct? Yes, that is correct, Evan. So that's why I like to put it as yes from the get-go, and then when I'm ready for this to actually be used in courses, that's where I go into the competency and I change the status from draft to approved. Yeah, I would agree. I'm just going to add some org units to this just so that we can see it in different areas of my test site. But I'm actually going to apply it to, maybe not under the Department of Sciences. I want to apply it to actually all courses, just for the purposes of this demo. So HE Sandbox is the name of my site, and I'm going to do all descendants too. So that way, no matter what course we're playing around with, we'll see it in there too, and save. So will we see this in courses now that we've shared it down? If I go into any course, let's say physics, the Competencies tool exists here too. It's found under Course Admin. And you'll see the Competencies tool under Assessment. And there we go. So we see the School of Education SLOs here, plus the learning objective that we created underneath. Evan, your question is, how does the add org units work differently than make competency and is children available to users? Basically, the difference is that if I were to say, don't let users see, so don't make the competency and its children available to users, but still add those org units. As an administrator, I can see it in here, and I can align it to different things, but the users never see it on their end, so they don't see it listed here. So the difference is that instructors and students can see this in the competency structure versus not, whereas adding the org units actually does share it down, and then the other thing just determines which users are able to see that it has been shared down. That makes sense. And we have a question here about, sorry, let me just scroll down. Can you describe the difference between competencies created in the Competencies tool and those created in the org unit editor? We need the ability to share rubrics and competencies as well as to report on those competencies through add-on reporting. Yeah, so that was a very simple way of doing it through the Competencies tool at a top level and share it down to courses. But there are going to be situations that, let's say you have a program assessment coordinator, and they don't have system administrative level rights in the learning environment, nor should they probably. So they need to create competency structures and share them down to the right courses, but they're not going to be able to do it at the very top level. They just don't have that administrative access. This is where you can go into the org unit editor and create program. If you have a program org unit, let's say, or a department org unit in there, then each of those org units have a home page, so you can have the Competencies tool listed in there so that a sub-administrator can create those structures. So here's what that looks like. You go into the org unit editor. I have a little bit of a messy hierarchy, so excuse me, but let's say let's look at that Department of Education again. I click on that. So I already created this department in the system, but this can work for departments, programs, whatever you'd like. I click on that, and there's a jump to home page. So if I enroll a department coordinator or program assessment coordinator into this area, so I click on jump to home page. then they have a course admin area in here as well. So this looks a lot like a course, but it's not being used as a course. There are no students in here, but you can have a program administrator or department coordinator use this in order to go into course admin at this level of the organizational unit hierarchy, go into the competencies tool here, see that they see all of the items that have been shared above the system to this specific org unit. We don't see actually all of the items because there are some that haven't been shared down to this level. But if I create things here and then say share down to all the courses that are under me, then that is a good way of having that sub-administration. The same thing goes, and so that's how to create the competency structures, but the same thing goes for creating rubrics as well, which goes into your question to you, Charlene. So step 2 is to build rubrics at higher levels of the organizational unit structure, whether that's the very top level, whether that's a sub-level, a program org unit, a program org unit, department, school, whatever you have, and then share them down to the courses or the areas in the environment that need it. So very similarly to the competency tool, if we go back to our site, we're going to see the rubrics tool, number 1, for a system administrator at the very top level here, admin tools, and then we have rubrics. And we can create rubrics here. So I have a bunch that I've created, portfolio assessments, whatever rubrics that you need here. And every time you create a rubric, so let me edit this specific rubric here, then you are going to see a make rubric available too. Works just like sharing competency structures down. You can either select specific courses that require or org units that need this, or say all descendants. So when I click on add org units, I could say, hey, all descendants under the health sciences department should be able to see this rubric because it applies to them. You can do this in a course template level. So if this is a rubric that's going to be used in all English 101 courses, then you could say all of the course offerings are created under the English 101 template as well. So a lot of flexibility on what gets shared down where. And again, if it makes more sense to create this rubric at a sub-org unit in the system, so program department, same idea here. If you go into the org unit editor, and you go into any of your org units that you've created, like departments, schools, programs, let's go into the Department of Health and Sciences, jump to the home page, or you can go straight into the course admin there, actually, if you prefer. Course admin. And there will be a rubrics tool under assessment as well. There it is. And again, you can create your rubrics here. I'm already seeing some rubrics that have been shared down to me. But if I create a new rubric, it's going to ask, hey, do you want to share this down to other sub-org units underneath down to the individual course level? So if you do that, if you create your competency structures and your rubric structures at higher levels, the appropriate higher level of the organizational unit hierarchy, it makes it really easy for you to be able to then use them in multiple courses or multiple areas that are going to be needed in the right areas. And then that brings us to step 3, essentially, is once we create those competency structures and those rubrics at higher levels and share them down, how do we then set up the assessment? So how are we going to assess them in the areas that we've shared them down to, and what's going to trigger achievement? And before we move on, I just want to, there's just a question coming in. So to clarify, you can create both rubrics and competencies in either the competency or the org unit editor without negative impact. That's from Charlene. So Charlene, yes, you can create both rubrics and competencies in that top-level competency tool that we saw, or by going through the org unit editor, going into a sub-org unit like a program department, and going into the competency tool and rubric tool there. Not only is that not without negative impact, but that actually is a good practice to make. in general, you want to create your competency structures and your rubrics at the lowest level that you can do so, that you can. So as an example, let's say that you have a rubric that's only going to be used, again, for English 101 courses. Then instead of creating it at the School of Education level or at the institutional level, you probably actually want to create that at the English 101 template level, going through the org unit editor, going into the home page of that template, and creating those rubrics and creating the competency structures that you need there. If it's an assessment or if it's an outcome that's going to be used across different English courses, then you might want to do it at the department or program level at that point, right? Because you can't do it at the course template level. It's not just applicable to the one course, but it is applicable to different courses under the English department. So you create at the English department level. If it is a institutional learning outcome that's going to be used in different programs, that's when you do it at the institutional level. So yes, definitely use those different levels, and just go down the organizational hierarchy as much as you can and create those items there. In fact, I'll mention this later in the presentation, but we do have consulting, our advisory and consulting services group. If you ask your account manager, they can do a pre-assessment and talk about the options, because they can go through what your assessment strategy is and say, hey, here's how we suggest you create your competency structure and your rubrics at these various levels. So they actually create a document for you with recommendations saying what should be created at what point. And that also helps to ensure that if you're using insights reports for aggregate reporting, which we'll go into in a moment, that everything is being set up in the right areas, so that optimizes aggregate reporting. Ted, great question. I don't have competencies on my tool list at the department level, only at the course level. Is there a way to turn them on at the department level? And Renee says, yes, that is roles and permissions. That is a great point, Ted. So sometimes if you haven't really been using programs and departments as, accessing them as home pages, you do need to go into roles and permissions and make sure that this is what I like to do. So let's look at an administrator or instructor role. You want to, actually, let's look at an instructor and then competencies. Same thing with rubrics too. You want to make sure that the columns here for department and program have the same types of check marks that are available on the course offering level. So I should be able to see competencies, I should be able to manage them, and create new learning objectives. So there are a few that actually are missing on my own site. So looking at the course offering column here in roles and permissions and making sure that the same check marks are done in the department and program column, that will fix your issue, Ted. Perfect, Renee. Yeah, it sounds like Renee learned that the hard way. Okay, good. So let's talk about how to, once we've shared things down, how do we actually align it to assessment activities? So let's talk about assessment strategy 1, where we're sharing down to courses, and they're going to be assessing courses, and then we'll talk about the other 2 as well. So let's say that this is going to be assessed in Physics 1203. Specifically, now we saw the list of different ways that it can be assessed. It could be tied to a grade item. It could be tied to a discussion, assignment, for example, a quiz as well. No matter what you pick, it is a very similar flow in terms of aligning the outcome and assigning what the achievement threshold is going to be. I'll show you 2 examples with assignments and quizzes, but then you'll be a pro at whatever you decide to do your assessment for. So under assignments, let's pick this individual assignment 1, and I'm going to edit the folder. This also is the same view that you would see when you are creating a new assignment. You will see an objectives tab here. So no matter when you're creating a quiz, a discussion, assignment, if you're editing a grade item, you're always going to see an objectives tab. And as you can see, I've already started to associate some learning objectives / outcomes to this assignment, and we're going to further develop that here. So the first step in this is to click on Associate Learning Objectives. And what you're going to see here are all of the competency structures that have been shared down to this course. I could even be working at a course template at this point, or a master course. That is actually a really good idea to do in order to help scaffold the experience for faculty. Instead of getting faculty to do this step, if you are using a master course model, do this at the master course model and then copy the course, and you're going to have all of your alignments already there for the instructors. So let's say that, let me look at, I'll just pick a few here. So a couple of writing objectives that applies here. That just says, okay, in general, this assignment is aligned to these objectives or these outcomes, but in order to determine what is going to be the trigger for achievement, I've got to specify that. So the next step here is to click on the drop-down arrow on the right-hand side and say Add an Assessment. Now, the assessment type can be numeric or rubric generally for an assignment or a submission Dropbox area. It's typically rubric-based because that is quite typical in that scenario, whereas for quizzes, it's generally numeric, but you generally have the option to do either. In this case, I'm going to do a rubric here, and I'm going to select the rubric that's going to be used for the assessment of this outcome that I've selected. Now, the really neat thing here is that this could be either the same rubric that's being used for grading the assignment, if it's being used for grading in a course, or it can be a different rubric entirely. So if you want instructors to be able to use whatever rubrics they feel comfortable with grading the assignment, but you want to specify specific rubrics that they should use in order to trigger the achievement of outcomes, then that's great. You select a different rubric than the one that's being used to grade the assignment, but you can do it all in one rubric as well. So here are a few different rubrics that I have that have been shared down to me. I pick the one, and then you pick the criteria. So is it going to be triggered by a certain overall rubric score, and what level is that going to be? Or, even more neat, I really love this, I can actually pick a specific criterion in the rubric that this applies to. So if I were to add 4 different learning outcomes, I could actually align each learning outcome to each of the criteria in the rubric. So BAM, instructors can use one rubric in order to assess their achievement of 4 outcomes at once. Really, really nice. So I like using that a lot. I like having multiple outcomes in one rubric. So I pick the criteria that this specific rubric is aligned to. Check off the box. This activity is required to complete the learning objective, and that will then allow you to determine the threshold score. So in this specific rubric, there are 5 performance levels, and I get to say what the threshold is going to be. So if I pick level 4, if students get a level 4 or higher, then that's going to trigger achievements there. And you can continue to do that. So for this other learning outcome that I've added, is that going to be defined by the second criteria, et cetera. So that's what I've started to do here. And indeed, if I go into, let's just save this, and go into viewing submissions for this, when I evaluate a student, I'm going to see the multiple rubrics there. So if I evaluate Megan here, I've done this a few times, so there are quite a number of rubrics. But again, instructors could see just the one rubric. If you wanted them to just use the one rubric, or multiple rubrics, if you wanted them to use a specific rubric for assessment of outcomes. So clicking on this, they'll be able to see all of the rubrics that were given. And for those that have learning outcomes tied to them, either for the overall score or for each individual criteria, there will be a little reminder. You'll see the yellow icon here under the criterion or under overall rubric score that lets them know, oh, right, this criterion here is aligned to this learning objective. So because we've specified, if students get a level 4 or higher, then if the instructor picks that, that's going to go towards their achievement. Same thing, very similar with quizzes. So if we go into physics, we go into quizzes. Let's just edit a quiz. We're going to see an objectives tab there as well. The difference is that we generally want to work as a numerical score. And instead of specifying individual criteria, we can specify down to individual question level in a quiz, because that obviously makes more sense in a quiz setup. So clicking on objectives here, again, I can associate the learning outcomes or objectives here. I can determine the assessment method here. So click Add Assessment, which I've already done. Is this based on a rubric, or is this based on a numeric score? And is it based on individual questions? And if it is based on specific questions, I can then click on this button here to associate those questions. So clicking on Associate Questions, I can then say if it is based on specific questions, not an overall threshold score for the quiz, these are the questions that I want it to be looking at. So you can pick a whole section. In this case, I did pick a whole section. Or you can pick specific questions here and say, and just check them off. So this question in here. So hopefully it gives you a start. You're going to get really good at it the more that you go into that Objectives tab. You'll see the differences there, and then you can assign your threshold. So now that we know a little bit about aligning to assessment activities, how does this apply to each outcome strategy? We were working with a course thinking about assessment strategy number 1, so that the student learning outcomes are being assessed within the courses. I already gave one implementation idea about that, and that instead of asking your faculty to set up these assessment alignments, you can actually do that for your faculty at a master course level, and then create child courses from that are actually going to go into the faculty. So those assignments, those rubrics, and those alignments are already set up for them. And if you don't have a specific assignment in mind, a great way of doing this is to create a placeholder. So you create an assignment at the master level, and you say, this is a creative writing assignment. Rename this assignment for whatever you want, but it already has the rubric aligned to it that you need, and it already has the creative writing outcome aligned to the rubric. And it's going to trigger achievement if you pick performance level 4 or above, or performance level 3 and above. So all they need to do then is to rename the assignment and then do the assignment in their own way. Or if you have more of a programmatic approach and you already have a full course master, then that's even easier because they don't have to rename the assignment. You've already determined what the assignment is, the full name, the description, the rubrics are all in there as well. Renee asks, does picking a quiz section work if it is a random section? Yes, Renee. So if you create a random section, yeah. So you're not selecting the individual questions there. You're actually selecting that section folder, and that works perfectly fine. Yeah, and you can say what the achievement threshold. So let's say there are 4 questions there. If you say they need to get 75% of the questions, then they need to get 3 out of the 4 random questions right. Yeah. Okay, so that's how you do it down to courses, but what if you have a program assessment requirement that falls outside of normal course activity? So that example, again, of a teaching portfolio at the end of a degree program, this student needs to show how they've achieved these teaching competencies over their program. Some implementation ideas here is to use have effective use of the ePortfolio tool in order to give students a structure that's needed in order to collect artifacts, but then also display what the best artifacts or the best evidence they have for achieving those outcomes are. And then use courses, but not as academic courses. You're going to be creating essentially what is a course in Brightspace, like you create a course, but it's not a course at all. It's used for a submission area for official assessment. So here's a quick example of that. Number one, with the ePortfolio, let me switch over to a student here and show a quick example. Megan Ahrens. So I'm using a handy administrative feature, Impersonate, which is great for, in general, just for troubleshooting. And I'm basically seeing exactly what Megan sees in the system without logging in as her. Here's a great example of Megan actually getting badges too through the awards tool. I find a lot of clients use that for competencies too. So because you can tie release conditions to trigger the sending of a badge to a student, one of those release conditions is competency and learning objective achievement. So that can be given to students too. It's a really neat way to get them really pumped up that, oh my God, I did actually achieve that creative writing outcome, either inside or outside of my courses. So that's an example of that. And if we go into Megan's ePortfolio and look at her items, she has some presentations here. Let's look at this graduate tributes, in which case this was a portfolio presentation that was created by, let's say, a program administrator in the ePortfolio tool, but they used the push feature to push it down to students. So it becomes an item, an editable presentation item in their ePortfolio, and they can start editing it to put their personal artifacts into it. So for critical thinking, it says enter artifacts here regarding critical thinking, samples of work, videos, etc. So they already have the pages, they already have the guidance, what kinds of artifacts that they should be putting in for each page. All they have to do is fill it out. So that's a great way, I find, to scaffold the experience for students, to allow them to organize their program-specific evidence of achievement. The second part to that is how do they then submit this portfolio when they're ready for formal program assessment, and that's using that course but not course idea that I was talking about. So if we get out of Megan, I can create a course offering in Brightspace through the course management area. Just ad hoc, create a new course. I probably actually want to create a new course template for this and say this is for School of Education program assessment. And that falls under the Department of Education in my specific case. Next, and the course that's not really a course is going to be called School of Education program portfolio submission or something. Whatever makes most sense that for you. So portfolio. Code doesn't really matter. Click next. And then in that new course, but not an actual course, there it is. You can just have a submission area there. So if I go into content, and I can make content the home page, that's what I typically would suggest so that you don't see announcements. Announcements are going to be used, but they just see the module. So submit your portfolio here. You could have instructions in this module as well, but at the very least you want to have an assignment or Dropbox, whatever it's called in your specific Brightspace learning environment, and call it whatever is here. So submit here, put in the instructions that you need, publish, and tie that to the rubric that you need to use, tie that to the achievement threshold here. So as a student, I go into this course area. It's not really an academic course. I see the submission drop box. I easily submit to there, and then there is an assessor that is going to go through that and then use a rubric in order to determine achievement. Evan asks, when you're finished, can you elaborate on the pros and cons of creating an ad hoc submission course versus using an actual academic course? Evan, it just really depends on the assessment strategy that you're using and what works. I mean, sometimes it's a combination, right? Like in general, you have these student learning outcomes that you want to be integrated into courses generally, and you want to really encourage faculty to be assessing those student learning outcomes in their assignments. I think that is a great strategy, and especially if you scaffold the process for them, make it easier, that you're already creating signature assessments for them. They have to just rename the assignment, or maybe you're just pushing the exact assignment that they have to use, depending on what fits. Then I think that's a great way, but there are going to be cases where there still is a graduate requirement, a graduation requirement that perfect case is teaching portfolio. So students are still going to have to create a portfolio of work in order to be certified to graduate and go into a certain profession. In that case, then use this, this strategy outside of a course. Also, it comes up too for the core competencies, which is a perfect segue because that's the last thing that I wanted to mention here. And that is, if you want to ensure students are meeting broader institutional outcomes or core competencies like creative writing, in that it's not going to be triggered just like naturally just from what they're doing in their various courses, but students should be able to also submit evidence from co-curricular activity. That's when you want to employ this course but not course submission area as well, so that students can say, hey, they can see the opportunities of all of the different ways that they could submit evidence for creative writing, having your own personal blog outside of your academic career and linking to that or showing some examples of that, posting to a community newspaper, then they can see those submission areas and they can receive badges and things like that. So that would be another opportunity. In fact, if we go into that site again, I do have an example of that. So here is core competencies, activities for students that I created before. And I actually even, although I don't have this set to the content tool as a homepage, what I did instead was I created a special nav bar. So there's a little overview of what the core competencies are and what we're looking for. Then there are the assignments themselves. So this is the content tool. So I've said, hey, here are all the communication activities, and these are all the different ways that you can submit evidence. So make an ePortfolio, learn to communicate in group environments, write a resume and cover letter, and they can submit there. Renee asks, what is your strategy for getting people into the ad hoc course? A BUM file or a bulk user management file still has to come from somewhere. Yeah, there needs to be a little bit of scripting in order to make that programmatic and seamless, Renee. If you can extract information out of your SIS as to who is enrolled in what program, then you can format that into an SIS, into a CSV file, either to process it through the SIS integration that you may have, or if you don't have SIS integration, then you could then format that for the bulk user management. I would recommend that there should be some sort of scheduled SIS integration in place in order to make that a nightly thing that is automatically being updated for the enrollments. It's not something that you're going to have to manually keep doing yourself through bulk user management. While we're here, I also have an example of a faculty toolbox for instructors to use these different, so back to the core competencies, there's communications, critical thinking, personal growth and responsibility, and informational technology literacy. This was an example of me creating a master and pushing down to different courses. So it's a toolkit idea. So I create these assignments here, and I say, hey, here's your communication activity, critical thinking, personal growth. Just rename these assignments. But already the rubric is aligned to it, and already this is going to trigger achievement. So if I push this module to all courses, institutionally, or all courses in my program, faculty are going to see this naturally in their courses. They're going to see it in draft mode. Their students don't see it. So all they have to do is rename the assignment, put in the instructions that they need for the specific assignment in their course, and then drag and drop this into the right module of their course. Yeah, okay, perfect. So that is essentially it in terms of the outcomes assessment strategies. The only other thing to talk about is how to review results. And there are a number of ways to do that in that in the competencies tool itself, you have the ability to review results. In the courses that you create, you see the results there as well. And then we have some aggregate reporting available in Insights. So just taking a quick minute to show those different items. If we go back to that physics, remember how we applied some specific assessment measurement there. If we go into course progress, which is generally in the nav bar, but looks like somebody removed it from my nav bar. It's a shared site, so it's always a little bit of a surprise sometimes. And then I can see objectives or outcomes here, right? So I can see in a course what are the outcomes, what is Megan passing, what is she not passing, and then why not. So these were the 4 activities that were aligned to the writing objective, and she did not meet one of them because the threshold was 70%, and she got a 64.8%. So you can see it on that level, or you can look at it through the competency level, so on a competency per competency basis. I can click on the competencies tool here under assessment, pick the item that I want to look at. So that was the writing objective that we saw. So if I click on the writing objective, I can click on results there and filter by completed, uncompleted here. So I should see that Frank has completed it in this course. And it gives me a little bit of information as to exactly why he did meet that or where he did meet that in the specific course. Not only can you do that within an individual course, but you can do that at higher levels of the environment where you originally created those competency structures. So remember how we created competency structures at the top level and at a program level. If I go into the competencies tool in that area, I will also have the ability to do some reporting. And I can go down to a learning outcome, or I can go down to where I can select competency. Let's look at critical thinking there, look at results, do a search for students here, and I should see who has completed that. Although I'm not sure students have met this one. I think for that creative writing, though, that they have met that. And yeah, sorry, it looks like we're running over just a couple of minutes, but this should be done. If anybody can stay for an extra 3 minutes, then we should be done here. So actually, I believe that I have, yes, so these writing objectives here. So I could look at results for the writing objective at this level, but then I can also look at results at this competency level, which is going to tell me if I see check marks there, it's basically that saying that students have achieved all of the learning outcomes underneath this structure. And I believe I have a couple of students that have met this. Let's see. And yes, so Frank has actually met all of the learning outcomes underneath. So in general, he gets the institutional level competencies in general education. And if I click on his name, then I get more information. on exactly what he got. So here are the check marks that are rolling up: analysis, analysis, another writing objective, and another writing objective. And because he has all 4 of those check marks, he got the overall check mark here. And I have a little bit of information on what course or courses he achieved each of the outcomes in. Evan asked, do students need to be enrolled in those higher level org units, i.e. templates, in order to show on the statistics? That is a good question, and I'm gonna further research that for the blog post and provide an official answer. It actually may be the case that it may be a yes, and I just want to double check, because it's not a problem if it's an institutional level, because the students are naturally enrolled at the institutional level. But it's true, I think I do recall needing to do that if I set something up at a program org unit or set something up at a course template, that I can't see user results unless those users are naturally enrolled in those org units. Not to say that the student would see that org unit when they are in the system, but that you're enrolling those users in the back end. Yeah, I think it's a yes, but I'm going to confirm for the blog. Okay, so let's say this is a great way to see this, but if you have to export this out of the system, there are a couple of options here. We do have a CSV data extract called the CLOE report, stands for Course Learning Outcome Evaluation. Ask your account manager. If you don't know your account manager, just email me. I'll put my email back on the slides in a sec, and then I'll find out who your account manager is. I think it's a small additional cost for us to set it up for you, but then once you have that, you could have that as a scheduled report that goes into an SFTP folder, and you can do whatever you want with that raw data, basically, in that Excel or CSV format. If you want to have some more advanced aggregate visualizations of the data, then that's when I would suggest having a look at the Insights tool that you may or may not have at your individual institution. So again, if you don't, you can ask your account manager. And if you don't know who that is, let me know. I will find out. Because it does give you a number of really good reports. And what I really like about it as well is that not only does it give you these really neat reports, but it comes built in with some consulting that will get our advisory and consulting services group to help you determine what is the best strategy to set this up in the environment and have the most effective use of these reports. So very quickly, I'll just skip a couple of slides here. This idea is that through the built-in reporting that we've just seen plus insights, you can really have a great continuous improvement of educational quality and outcomes assessment. And through insights, here are some sample reports. So course learning outcomes, you can drill down to the individual course, but in this case, you don't have to go into the course to find it out. You're getting a report through the insights tool, and you can filter exactly what course or courses you want to look at. Same thing with program. So looking at all learning outcomes that have been defined under program, how are students achieving those? How many students are achieving or not achieving those program learning outcomes? Also a really great report, if you are creating competency structures at higher levels and sharing them down to courses, this learning outcome alignment report is going to let you know, are they actually being assessed in those courses? So you can do a little bit of an audit here, and you can say, okay, I've created these higher level outcomes. I've shared it down to these courses or these programs. The check mark says, yes, it's been shared down properly. The triangle says, yes, not only has it been shared down properly, but it is aligned to an assessment, and there is an assessment threshold that's going to trigger achievement. But if you see a red triangle with an X, it means that it's in there, it's been aligned to an assessment, but nobody's defined a threshold for achievement yet. So there's nothing that's going to trigger achievement here. Curriculum mapping is very similar to that. And then you have, generally with these reports, you have the ability to filter by roles, by courses, whatever you want, so that once you do a filter, then you look at the data there, and all of the data is exportable as well. So right now I'm looking at progress on competency achievement across a specific set of courses that I've filtered for. I see red is not achieved, yellow is achieved by some, blue is achieved by all. I see further data underneath, and then I always have the ability to export through Excel, PDF, CSV, etc. So I can take that report. And you can define different roles in your institution to have access to these different reports and be able to generate these reports. So Insights is a great way to have give program administrators the ability to run their own reports. And we've got a few, so you can drill down to achievements by course. You can drill down to achievement by individual student. A lot of different reports depending on the specific visualization of data that you need. All right, so that is essentially it. Thanks so much for staying with me a little bit over. Some really good questions. If you have any other questions, I'm just going to review the chat here, but feel free to put those in. It sounds like people are answering each other's questions too, which is super amazing. Again, if you want to talk to your account manager about any advisory and consulting options, if you are ready to start implementing this Brightspace, but you want to have a pre-consulting session, account manager can set that up. So send an email to them, say, hey, I attended this webinar that Delia did. I want to talk to somebody in advisory and consulting just to see, I've generated some ideas from this webinar, hopefully, on how I want to implement it in Brightspace. I just want to go through those ideas and see and verify that this is a good idea and what options are available for consulting as well if I need it. I think that's great. You can get an hour of our advisory and consulting services time in order to just verify that that's a really good strategy. And Renee mentions, how can I learn more about the last bit? I assume you're talking about the Insights achievement reports. Drop me an email, Renee. I'll make sure actually in the blog post that I provide a link to documentation. We have documentation about all the Insights reports, but also reach out to your account manager too, and they can set up a demonstration of the different Insights reports so you can go into a deep dive. That's a really good idea as well. Okay, any last remaining questions? Okay, I think we are good. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have been given at least one or maybe more ideas of how to implement your specific assessment strategy or strategies in Brightspace. And again, as Roxana mentioned, we'll post the answers to any unanswered questions and the blog post as well. Insights Achievement, great. And then we'll post a link to some more information on Insights Achievement reports in the blog post as well. Ted, unfortunately, I will not be going to Fusion. This is the first year in 5 years I'm not going because so many teammates on my team are going as well. I have many solution engineers on my team that are going. You'll see us there, but unfortunately I'll have to miss out. So enjoy DC for those of you who are going. I think it's great. I will be watching remotely on all the keynote sessions, so I'm excited. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.